Welcome to the Mythic History, explaining why history happened the way it did. In 1812, British and American ships fired on each other across the Atlantic world. Neither side believed the other could be trusted. In London, many still doubted the American Republic would survive at all. In Washington, Britain remained the shadow behind every fear of lost independence. A century later, British and American soldiers shared trenches in Europe. Their governments coordinated strategy, pooled intelligence, and depended on each other's survival. War between them was no longer considered possible. There was no treaty that ended their hostility, no speech that declared forgiveness, and no single moment when rivalry suddenly turned into friendship. What changed was not sentiment, but usefulness. This is the story of how opposition quietly stopped making sense, and how cooperation replaced it without either side ever admitting that something had ended. When the United States emerged from the War of Independence, it did not escape Britain's orbit. Political authority had been severed, but economic and cultural ties remained deeply intact. Trade routes, financial networks, and legal habits built over generations did not disappear with independence. They continued because neither society could easily function without them. The War of 1812 reinforced this uneasy reality. The conflict ended without territorial change and without a decisive settlement of grievances. For American leaders, the war confirmed a lingering fear that Britain still viewed the United States as subordinate. For British officials, it demonstrated that the former colonies could no longer be coerced, but also that they remained economically valuable. Despite hostility, trade resumed almost immediately. American agricultural exports flowed into British markets, while British manufactured goods continued to dominate American consumption. Merchants and financiers rebuilt pre-war relationships not out of nostalgia, but necessity. Severing economic ties entirely would have imposed costs that neither government was prepared to accept. Political attitudes reflected this tension. In Britain, skepticism toward the American experiment remained widespread. One prominent British observer remarked that he did not believe the American Union would long endure as a single power. Such doubts were not rhetorical flourishes. They shaped how British leaders assessed risk, patience, and the possibility of future fragmentation. In the United States, distrust ran just as deep. Britain was not viewed as a former ruler that had stepped aside gracefully, but as a power still capable of interference. American policymakers remained alert to British movements in North America and the Atlantic. Peace existed, but it was maintained through vigilance rather than confidence. This early phase matters because it establishes the baseline of the relationship. Britain and the United States did not transition from hatred to friendship. They moved from war into a prolonged period of managed antagonism, where restraint was practiced because renewed conflict offered little advantage. As the 19th century unfolded, this balance would be tested repeatedly. The United States would begin to articulate broader ambitions, while Britain weighed how much resistance those ambitions warranted. The first major test would come not through war, but through a declaration that revealed both American intent and American limitation. In 1823, President James Monroe stood before Congress and articulated a principle that appeared to redraw the political boundaries of the Western Hemisphere. European powers, he declared, should no longer attempt to establish new colonies in the Americas. Any such effort would be viewed as a threat to American security. The statement sounded decisive, even defiant, and it has often been remembered as a declaration of dominance. At the time, however, American leaders were acutely aware of the gap between aspiration and capacity. The United States possessed neither the naval strength nor the military reach to enforce such a doctrine on its own. Its navy was small, its army modest, and its ability to project power beyond its shores limited. Monroe's words were bold, but they rested on a fragile foundation. That foundation existed because Britain found the doctrine convenient. British policymakers had little interest in seeing rival European empires return to Latin America, where British trade had expanded rapidly after the collapse of Spanish rule. Stability mattered more than sovereignty. A hemisphere closed to new colonial ventures suited British commercial priorities, even if it was framed as an American principle. This alignment was understood, even if rarely stated aloud. The Monroe Doctrine worked not because the United States could enforce it, but because Britain's navy made enforcement unnecessary. American leaders benefited from British power without formally acknowledging dependence on a former imperial adversary. Britain, in turn, avoided confrontation while securing its economic position. The arrangement reflected a shared realism rather than cooperation. British Foreign Secretary George Canning privately dismissed the idea that the United States was acting alone, noting that Britain had effectively called the New World into existence to redress the balance of the old. His remark was not intended for American ears, but it revealed how British officials interpreted the situation as a useful alignment of interests rather than a concession of authority. For American policymakers, the doctrine served another purpose. It announced intent. It signaled how the United States wished to be treated in the future, even if it could not yet enforce those wishes. The declaration was as much about shaping expectations as about immediate power. It allowed the United States to claim moral leadership while time and growth did the rest. This episode set an enduring pattern. Assertions of principle were moderated by recognition of limits, and disputes were shaped by incentives rather than ideology. Britain did not challenge the doctrine because it did not threaten British interests. The United States did not press further because it lacked the means to do so. As American confidence grew, the distance between declared authority and actual power would narrow. But until that happened, the relationship remained one of cautious accommodation. The next tests would show how this balance held when principles met reality in places where interests did not align so neatly. In the decades after the Monroe Doctrine, Britain and the United States encountered situations that tested how seriously each took the other's claims. These moments were rarely dramatic, but they mattered because they established habits. Each dispute became a practical lesson in where power actually lay, and how far either side was willing to push without risking escalation. One such test came in 1833, when Britain asserted control over the Falkland Islands. The action appeared to contradict the principle that European powers should not extend their presence in the Americas. The United States protested diplomatically, invoking the language of hemispheric responsibility. Yet the protest ended there. American leaders understood that they lacked the naval reach to challenge Britain in the South Atlantic, and Britain understood that American objections carried little immediate consequence. For British officials, the decision was guided by logistics rather than ideology. Control of strategic maritime points mattered to a global empire whose strength rested on sea lanes. The Falklands were not a statement about the United States, but a calculation about imperial mobility. American displeasure was noted, but it did not alter the assessment that resistance would be symbolic rather than substantive. A different dynamic emerged in the Pacific during the early 1840s. British interest in the Hawaiian Islands raised concerns in Washington, where American missionaries, merchants, and diplomats had already established a strong presence. This time, the United States issued a clearer warning against interference. The difference was not rhetoric, but credibility. American influence in Hawaii was real, and the region lay closer to American capacity. Britain chose not to press the issue. The Hawaiian Islands were not central to British strategy, and challenging American claims there offered little reward. The decision to step back reflected a growing willingness to accommodate American concerns when they intersected with areas of emerging American strength. It was not a concession of principle, but a recognition of priorities. These episodes revealed an informal understanding taking shape. The United States asserted itself selectively, choosing battles it believed it could sustain. Britain resisted where its interests were essential and accommodated where they were not. Neither side sought confrontation for its own sake. Conflict was avoided not through agreement, but through calculation. Over time, this pattern reduced the risk of misjudgment. Each government learned the other's thresholds. Disputes were no longer interpreted automatically as preludes to war, but as signals to be evaluated. Hostility remained, but it was contained within predictable limits. By the middle of the 19th century, this fragile equilibrium had become familiar. It would soon be tested under far greater strain, when internal conflict in the United States forced Britain to weigh its interests amid uncertainty, pressure, and the possibility of unintended escalation. When civil war broke out in the United States in 1861, Britain was forced to confront a conflict it could not ignore, yet could not easily influence. The war was internal, but its consequences were global. British industry depended heavily on imported raw materials, and no commodity was more critical than cotton. Almost immediately, The conflict disrupted supply chains that sustained entire regions of the British economy. By this point, Britain had abolished slavery throughout its empire and publicly defined itself as an opponent of the institution. On moral grounds alone, sympathy for the Union might have seemed natural, yet British leaders were responsible for preventing economic collapse and social unrest at home. Southern cotton supplied the mills of Lancashire, and shortages threatened unemployment on a massive scale. Ideology mattered, but it competed directly with material survival. British policymakers also doubted the war's outcome. Early Confederate successes fed skepticism about whether the Union could restore control over the seceded states. Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister, privately questioned whether the American Union was truly sustainable. These doubts were not expressions of hostility so much as reflections of uncertainty. If separation proved permanent, Britain would have to decide how to deal with two American states rather than one. Recognition of the Confederacy was considered, but never lightly. Such a move might stabilize trade and shorten the conflict, but it carried grave risks. American leaders made clear that recognition would be treated as hostile intervention. A war with the United States, while Britain's global commitments were already stretched, was an outcome British officials were determined to avoid unless absolutely necessary. Neutrality emerged as the least damaging option. Britain refrained from recognition while continuing trade where legally permissible. This satisfied neither side. In Washington, neutrality looked suspiciously close to indifference. In Britain, industrial communities suffered as cotton supplies dwindled. Yet restraint prevailed because escalation promised greater costs than patience. As the war dragged on, British calculations shifted. Alternative cotton sources were developed, reducing dependence on the American South. Meanwhile, the Union endured longer than many in London had expected. Each passing year made intervention less attractive and more dangerous. What began as cautious hedging evolved into deliberate non-involvement. This period reinforced a pattern already familiar in Anglo-American relations. Britain acted to protect its interests without committing to confrontation. The United States, fighting for national survival, watched British behavior closely, but recognized its own limits. The balance held, but only just. Under wartime pressure, even a single misstep could still turn restraint into conflict. In November 1861, the fragile balance Britain and the United States had maintained for decades came close to collapsing over a single decision at sea. The American Civil War was still in its early stages. Uncertainty dominated strategic thinking, and both governments were operating under intense pressure. It was in this atmosphere that a Union warship intercepted the British mail steamer Trent. Aboard the Trent were two Confederate diplomats bound for Europe. The Union officer who ordered their removal believed he was acting decisively to protect the Union's position abroad. Preventing foreign recognition of the Confederacy was considered essential to winning the war. In that moment, urgency outweighed caution, and the seizure was treated as a legitimate wartime action rather than a diplomatic risk. In Britain, the response was immediate and volatile. The interception of a British vessel by an American warship was widely seen as a violation of neutrality and an affront to national sovereignty. Newspapers revived memories of earlier maritime disputes, noting the irony that the United States was now acting in ways it had once condemned. Public anger placed enormous pressure on the government to respond forcefully. British leaders prepared for the possibility of war. Troops were reinforced in Canada, naval deployments were reviewed, and contingency plans were drawn up. Yet, even as these measures advanced, senior officials hesitated. A war with the United States would be costly, unpredictable, and distracting at a time when Britain's global responsibilities were already heavy. Principle mattered, but so did proportionality. In Washington, the danger was quickly recognized. President Abraham Lincoln and his advisors understood that confrontation with Britain could be disastrous while the Union was fighting for survival. Legal arguments were reassessed, and attention turned to the fact that the seizure contradicted long-standing American positions on neutral rights. What had initially appeared as firmness now threatened to become strategic overreach. The resolution came through restraint rather than victory. The United States released the diplomats, framing the decision as adherence to international law rather than submission to British pressure. Britain accepted the outcome without demanding further concessions. Both governments avoided public humiliation, but neither claimed triumph. What mattered was the avoidance of a war neither side could afford. The Trent affair left a deep impression. It demonstrated how quickly unresolved suspicion could escalate under stress, and how restraint, even when politically unpopular, could preserve broader interests. The crisis did not create trust, but it reinforced a shared understanding. Another war between Britain and the United States would serve neither nation's future. That lesson would shape how both governments approached the unresolved consequences of Britain's wartime conduct once the Civil War ended, issues that still lay between caution and reconciliation. The end of the American Civil War removed the immediate danger of escalation, but it did not restore confidence between Britain and the United States. The war had closed without a final reckoning over Britain's conduct, and unresolved grievances quickly resurfaced. Chief among them was Britain's role in allowing Confederate warships to be built and launched from British ports. During the conflict, several British shipyards had produced vessels for the Confederacy, most famously the commerce raider CSS Alabama. These ships inflicted significant damage on Union merchant shipping, driving up insurance costs and disrupting transatlantic trade. In Washington, this was not viewed as a technical oversight, but as a failure of neutrality that had prolonged the war and imposed real economic harm. American leaders faced a choice. They could pursue these claims through confrontation, or they could seek accountability through law. The decision to favor arbitration reflected a change in posture. The United States emerged from the war more unified and industrially powerful, but also aware that open conflict with Britain would undermine the stability it was trying to consolidate. In London, the issue was equally sensitive. British officials rejected the idea that the government had deliberately aided the Confederacy. At the same time, they recognized that prolonged dispute with a rising power carried its own risks. Britain's global position depended increasingly on predictability and legal order, not just naval strength. Arbitration offered a way to resolve the dispute without appearing to concede intent. The settlement that followed required Britain to pay compensation for the damage caused by Confederate raiders. It was a pragmatic outcome rather than a moral one. Britain did not apologize, and the United States did not frame the payment as vindication. Both sides treated the matter as a problem to be closed, not a relationship to be repaired. What mattered more than the outcome was the process. A serious grievance between two major powers had been resolved without threats or force. This assumed continuity. Both governments acted on the understanding that their relationship would persist, and that managing disagreement was more important than relitigating the past. By the 1870s, Britain and the United States were no longer active adversaries, but neither had become a trusted partner. The relationship rested on restraint, legal mechanisms, and mutual calculation. The next transformation would come not from settling old disputes, but from new pressures that forced Britain to reconsider how it exercised power in the Western Hemisphere. In 1895, a long-running boundary dispute between British Guiana and Venezuela became the setting for a quiet but consequential change in Anglo-American relations. The disagreement itself was not new, and for years it had attracted little urgency in London. What transformed it into a crisis was the decision by the United States to intervene with a confidence it had not previously displayed. American leaders framed their involvement as a matter of regional responsibility rather than confrontation. They called for arbitration and warned that Britain's continued refusal would be interpreted as disregard for American interests in the Western Hemisphere. This time, the warning carried weight. The United States now possessed a stronger navy, a larger economy, and a political culture increasingly willing to assert authority beyond its borders. For Britain, the timing could not have been worse. Strategic attention was shifting toward Europe, where new industrial powers posed direct challenges to British security. Germany's expanding naval ambitions and Russia's movements in Asia demanded resources and focus. The Venezuelan dispute, while important, did not justify a serious confrontation with a country whose influence was clearly growing. British leaders therefore faced a calculation rather than a test of pride. Insisting on unilateral control risked drawing Britain into an unnecessary dispute while weakening its position elsewhere. Accepting arbitration, by contrast, offered a way to preserve British interests without escalation. The decision reflected prioritization, not retreat. When Britain agreed to arbitration, it marked a subtle but meaningful adjustment. By accepting American mediation, Britain acknowledged that the United States now exercised legitimate influence in the hemisphere. The choice was framed in legal and procedural terms, but its implications were broader. Britain was no longer treating American assertions as symbolic or dismissible. The arbitration itself largely favored British territorial claims, reinforcing the sense that Britain had not surrendered its interests. For American observers, however, the outcome mattered less than the process. Britain had engaged respectfully and treated American involvement as normal rather than intrusive. That behavior signaled recognition. This episode altered expectations on both sides. In London, the United States began to appear less as a disruptive former colony and more as a power whose cooperation could reduce strategic strain. In Washington, Britain appeared less as an imperial obstacle and more as a state capable of accommodation when interests aligned. The Venezuela crisis did not create partnership, nor did it erase decades of suspicion, but it changed the tone of the relationship. Rivalry gave way to recognition, and future disagreements would be evaluated through that lens. From this point forward, the question was no longer whether Britain and the United States could coexist, but how their expanding responsibilities might be managed without conflict. By the end of the 19th century, the pressures shaping British and American policy began to align in ways that made sustained rivalry increasingly impractical. The United States had completed its continental expansion and emerged from the Civil War with a stronger federal government and rapidly growing industrial capacity. Its economy was now integrated into global markets, and its leaders could no longer assume that distance alone would shield American interests from foreign instability. The Spanish-American War accelerated this transformation. Victory brought overseas territories and new strategic responsibilities, along with a clear understanding that American security depended on stable trade routes and predictable maritime order. The United States was no longer only guarding its independence, it was beginning to manage influence. That shift altered how American leaders evaluated other great powers, including Britain. Britain faced a parallel but more urgent reckoning. Its empire remained vast, but maintaining it demanded resources that were no longer unlimited. Industrial rivals were building fleets and challenging British naval dominance, forcing hard choices about where power had to be concentrated. European tensions increasingly defined British strategic thinking, reducing the appetite for confrontation in regions where vital interests were not at stake. In this context, Britain and the United States discovered that many of their priorities overlapped. Both benefited from open trade, stable sea lanes, and the absence of new colonial competition in the Atlantic world. Both preferred an international order that limited disruption rather than encouraged expansionist conflict. Differences that once felt threatening now appeared manageable when set against larger risks. This convergence did not produce public declarations or formal agreements. Instead, it influenced how each government interpreted the actions of the other. British policymakers began to see American assertions in the Western Hemisphere as contributing to stability rather than undermining it. American leaders, in turn, found fewer reasons to view British power as an inherent danger to sovereignty. The result was compatibility rather than closeness. Cooperation emerged because it solved practical problems, not because it satisfied sentiment. Each side adjusted expectations, recognizing that coordination reduced strain while rivalry consumed attention better directed elsewhere. These adjustments were quiet, but they reshaped assumptions that had guided policy for decades. As these shared constraints took hold, they began to influence concrete decisions. Britain reconsidered how much force it needed to project in regions where American influence was becoming decisive. The United States accepted greater responsibility for maintaining order in its surroundings. Together, these choices prepared the ground for a new phase of interaction, one in which cooperation would become visible through action rather than rhetoric. At the turn of the 20th century, Britain and the United States began to behave as though certain questions between them no longer required constant negotiation. There was no treaty to formalize this shift, and no declaration that rivalry had ended. Instead, cooperation took shape through a series of practical decisions that reflected growing confidence in how the other side would act. For Britain, one of the most telling adjustments involved naval strategy. Throughout the 19th century, British warships had maintained a strong presence in the Caribbean to protect imperial trade routes and deter interference. As tensions with continental powers intensified, particularly with Germany, British leaders reassessed where their fleet was most urgently needed. The Western Hemisphere, once an area of concern, now appeared comparatively stable. This reassessment depended on a new assumption that the United States would act to preserve order in its immediate surroundings. American leaders were increasingly willing to accept that role. Under President Theodore Roosevelt, the United States expanded its naval capacity and articulated a more assertive approach to regional stability. While this posture was framed as an expression of American responsibility, it also reduced the likelihood that Britain would be drawn into disputes far from Europe. The absence of a formal alliance was deliberate. Both governments valued flexibility and avoided binding commitments that could limit their freedom of action. Yet their decisions aligned in practice. Britain concentrated naval resources closer to home, confident that American influence would deter challenges in the Caribbean. The United States consolidated its position, interpreting British withdrawal not as retreat, but as recognition. This period also reshaped mutual perceptions. American policymakers no longer viewed British naval power as an implicit threat to independence. British officials, in turn, began to see American expansion as a stabilizing force rather than a disruption to imperial order. Each side demonstrated restraint in moments that could have reignited suspicion, reinforcing the sense that cooperation was reliable. What sustained this arrangement was consistency rather than sentiment. Over time, both governments acted predictably within understood spheres of influence. Disagreements still arose, but they were managed quietly and without escalation. Rivalry no longer organized policy, because it no longer addressed the problems either side faced. By the early years of the 20th century, Britain and the United States had established a working relationship based on mutual confidence in outcomes. When a global crisis eventually demanded clearer alignment, this foundation ensured that cooperation would feel natural rather than forced. When war erupted in Europe in 1914, the United States did not immediately align itself with Britain. President Woodrow Wilson declared neutrality, reflecting both public opinion and a long-standing desire to avoid entanglement in European conflicts. On the surface, this appeared consistent with American tradition. Beneath it, however, years of shifting incentives had already narrowed the range of realistic choices. Economic ties were the first force pulling the United States closer to Britain. American industry and agriculture became deeply integrated into the Allied war effort, supplying food, raw materials, and manufactured goods on a scale that reshaped the American economy. American banks extended vast loans to Britain and France, binding American financial stability to their survival. A British defeat would not have remained a distant geopolitical event. It would have reverberated directly through American markets. Security concerns soon followed. German submarine warfare increasingly threatened neutral shipping, including American vessels engaged in transatlantic trade. Each attack tested the credibility of neutrality. The issue was not sympathy for Britain, but whether the United States could accept repeated violations of its commercial rights without response. Britain's struggle at sea, once an imperial concern, now intersected with American interests in a way that neutrality could not fully address. Diplomatic developments reinforced this trajectory. In Berlin, German leaders viewed American involvement as inevitable and sought to redirect it. The Zimmermann Telegram, which proposed cooperation with Mexico against the United States, confirmed fears in Washington that the war's consequences would not remain confined to Europe. The international order itself appeared at stake. In that calculation, Britain was no longer a distant power, but a central participant in a struggle whose outcome mattered profoundly to American security. When the United States entered the war in 1917, it did so after years of gradual alignment rather than sudden conversion. Cooperation with Britain had become familiar through arbitration, parallel strategy, and consistent restraint. The decision to fight alongside Britain followed from accumulated pressures that left few credible alternatives. The war itself accelerated patterns already in place. Military coordination, intelligence sharing, and economic integration deepened habits of cooperation that had formed long before American troops arrived in Europe. By the time the conflict ended, Britain and the United States had not simply fought on the same side. They had learned how to operate together. World War I did not create alignment from nothing. It revealed how thoroughly earlier rivalries had been overtaken by shared constraints. What once separated Britain and the United States now mattered less than what bound their interests together. By the time the First World War came to an end, there was no single decision that marked the end of hostility between Britain and the United States. No treaty declared reconciliation, and no leader claimed that past rivalries had been resolved. What existed instead was a record of behavior that no longer treated conflict between the two as imaginable or useful. Over more than a century, repeated crises had forced both governments to confront the limits of confrontation. Each dispute over hemispheric authority, neutrality, commerce, and war had been resolved not through dominance but through restraint shaped by incentives and risk. The Monroe Doctrine functioned because Britain allowed it to. Civil war neutrality held because intervention carried unacceptable costs. Arbitration replaced force because stability mattered more than revisiting old grievances. These choices accumulated quietly, altering expectations on both sides. As American power expanded, Britain adjusted without attempting to reverse the shift. This was not generosity, but calculation. Britain's strategic priorities increasingly lay elsewhere, and insisting on control in the Western Hemisphere offered diminishing returns. Accommodation preserved influence more effectively than resistance. For the United States, growing authority brought its own constraints. Stability depended less on opposing Britain than on ensuring that British power did not disrupt emerging American responsibilities. What ultimately ended hostility was predictability. Over time, each nation demonstrated that it would respect certain boundaries and respond to pressure in recognizable ways. The fear that disagreement would naturally lead to war faded. Rivalry stopped organizing policy because it no longer solved the problems either side actually faced. By the early 20th century, Britain no longer planned for conflict with the United States, and the United States no longer defined itself in opposition to British power. Cooperation did not require trust in motives, only confidence in outcomes. That confidence had been built gradually through decisions made under pressure rather than gestures of goodwill. When Britain and America fought on the same side in World War I, it did not mark the beginning of a new relationship. It confirmed one that had already changed. Long before alignment became visible, opposition had quietly ended, when rivalry ceased to offer advantage and restraint proved the more reliable path forward.